February 1942. Inside a command post at Camp Elliott, California, a critical demonstration unfolds before a room of skeptical Marine Corps staff officers. The test is simple but brutal. A standard encrypted military message normally requires 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode using conventional cipher machines. But today, two new recruits, using absolutely no mechanical equipment, transmit and decode the exact same complex tactical order flawlessly in under 20 seconds. The impossible speed of this demonstration shatters existing military signals doctrine, which dictates that any unwritten communication is a massive security risk. How did two men with a simple radio completely outperform sophisticated mechanical cryptography? The popular narrative often reduces the Navajo Code Talkers to a romanticized legend. Native Americans simply speaking their mother tongue over the radio to baffle Japanese eavesdroppers. But in military intelligence, simply broadcasting in an obscure language is not a secure cipher. It is a critical vulnerability. Expert enemy linguists can rapidly deduce syntax, recognize names, and infer context. What those officers at Camp Elliott actually witnessed was not a casual conversation, but the meticulous construction of a highly structured, impenetrable cryptographic system. It was a radical concept, forged from a complex, unwritten language, and its inception came from entirely outside the military establishment. Philip Johnston, a civil engineer and World War I veteran, raised on a Navajo reservation, bypassed strict naval intelligence protocols with a desperate proposal. He convinced the Marine Corps to transform a linguistic structure into a rigid tactical weapon. The Navajo recruits were not just talking, they were operating a precise system of substitutions. They built an assigned dictionary of modern military terms that did not exist in their native tongue, welding it to a secondary phonetic alphabet. It was the rigorous, mechanical reality of military cryptography executed entirely in the human mind. Yet demonstrating theoretical speed in a quiet command post is one thing. How exactly did an improvised spoken code survive the brutal operational friction of the Pacific War, remaining completely unbroken when sophisticated mechanical ciphers repeatedly failed? To understand why the Marine Corps was willing to entertain such a radical proposal from a civilian, you must first understand the catastrophic communications failure facing American forces in the Pacific Theater in early 1942. The United States military was bleeding out due to a fatal systemic bottleneck in frontline radio transmission. In the sprawling, chaotic environment of jungle warfare, the fundamental rule of combat is speed. Units needed to coordinate artillery fire, direct close air support, and relay precise enemy troop movements across miles of dense, impassable terrain. The only practical method was voice radio. The problem was that anyone with a receiver tuned to the correct frequency could listen in. The Japanese military fully understood this vulnerability. Their Imperial Army and Navy intelligence divisions maintained large teams of highly trained, English-speaking cryptanalysts. These listening posts meticulously monitored American tactical frequencies. Their proficiency was terrifying. They did not just intercept standard military chatter, they actively engaged in signals deception. Fluent Japanese operators would break into American networks using perfect English colloquialisms and fake call signs. They issued false orders to American artillery batteries, directing fire onto friendly positions or deliberately routing reinforcement columns into carefully prepared ambushes. The Japanese ability to exploit open voice communication was costing American lives at an unsustainable rate. The standard American response to this threat was mechanical encryption. The military possessed sophisticated cipher machines, complex electromechanical devices that scrambled text into highly secure, mathematically robust code before it was transmitted via Morse code. The receiving operator would then use an identical, synchronized machine to decrypt the text back into readable English. In theory, this system provided absolute security. In practice, on the front lines of a rapidly moving island assault, it was a lethal liability. The mechanical encryption process was painfully, dangerously slow, encoding a standard tactical message, transmitting the complex string of Morse code over the radio, and then physically decrypting it on the other side required a minimum of 30 minutes, often much longer under fire. In the unforgiving geometry of modern combat, 30 minutes is an eternity. By the time a frontline commander encrypted a request for an artillery strike and the rear batteries decoded the coordinates, the Japanese infantry had often overrun the position or the target had completely relocated. If a Marine battalion commander needed to urgently redirect his armor support to counter a flanking maneuver, waiting half an hour to transmit the order securely often meant the destruction of his command. This rigid, slow bureaucracy of encryption was fundamentally failing against the speed of rapid Japanese intelligence gathering and decentralized battlefield tactics. The Marines desperately needed the speed of open voice radio combined with the absolute security of mechanical encryption. This was widely considered a physical impossibility. Into this desperate logistical and tactical vacuum stepped Philip Johnston. Johnston was a civilian civil engineer living in Los Angeles, but his background was highly unusual. As the son of a Protestant missionary, he had spent his childhood living on a remote Navajo reservation. He was one of the very few non-Navajo individuals in the world fluent in the language. When Johnston read early news reports detailing the severe communication difficulties the military was experiencing in the Pacific, he realized that the solution was not a faster machine, but a faster language. He bypassed the rigid naval intelligence bureaucracy and requested a meeting with Major General Clayton B. Vogel, the commanding general of the Amphibious Corps Pacific Fleet. Johnston presented an audacious, highly unconventional solution based entirely on linguistic isolation. He proposed recruiting fluent Navajo speakers to serve as combat radio operators. Johnston's argument was built on the unique structural properties of the Navajo language. It is an incredibly complex, tonal language belonging to the Athabascan language family. It had no alphabet and existed almost entirely as an oral tradition. Its grammatical structure, tonal inflections, and syntax are so radically different from English, German, or Japanese that it is exceptionally difficult for an adult outsider to learn. More critically for military intelligence, in 1942, the language was entirely unrecorded in any comprehensive academic literature. There were no Navajo to English dictionaries available in foreign libraries. Unlike European languages, or even other indigenous North American dialects, Navajo had never been extensively studied by foreign linguists. Johnston reliably estimated that outside of the reservation, less than 30 non-Navajo individuals worldwide could speak the language, and none of them were Japanese. If Navajo speakers were placed on both ends of a radio transmission, they could relay complex tactical information instantaneously via voice. Even if Japanese intelligence intercepted the frequency, the transmission would sound like incomprehensible noise. There would be no syntax to analyze, no phonetic patterns to map, and no vocabulary to translate. To the conservative signals officers of the era, the idea bordered on absurdity. Military doctrine dictated uniformity, standardization, and reliance on heavily guarded mathematical codes. Trusting the security of critical battle plans to an undocumented, unwritten civilian language seemed reckless. However, the pressure of mounting casualties and the undeniable failure of existing systems forced General Vogel's hand. He cautiously authorized a preliminary test, which Johnston organized at Camp Elliott. Following the shocking success of that initial 20-second demonstration, General Vogel immediately grasped the immense tactical potential. He urgently recommended the recruitment of 200 Navajos for the signals program. The Marine Corps tentatively accepted the proposal, officially launching the initiative. In May 1942, the first group of 29 Navajo recruits, many of whom had never left the reservation before, were sworn into the United States Marine Corps. They were transported to Camp Pendleton, California, to begin specialized signals training. The military had placed a massive, unprecedented bet on linguistic isolation. But the moment the recruits actually attempted to use their language in a simulated combat scenario, the Marine Corps immediately discovered a catastrophic flaw in the plan. The flaw was fundamentally linguistic. The Navajo language had evolved over centuries in the high deserts of the American Southwest. It was intimately tied to the natural world and completely devoid of any conceptual equivalent for 20th century mechanized warfare. When a Marine communications officer handed a recruit a standard tactical message detailing an artillery barrage from a mortar battery on a concrete pillbox, the transmission ground to a halt. There was no Navajo word for mortar. There was no word for pillbox, machine gun, dive bomber, or amphibious tractor. Direct word-for-word translation was physically impossible. If the operators attempted to describe these complex military concepts on the fly, the messages became hopelessly long and structurally inconsistent. One operator might describe a tank as a steel turtle, while another might call it a crawling gun. The critical speed advantage vanished instantly, and the resulting confusion was a tactical liability. To solve this, the Marine Corps realized they could not just use the language, they had to weaponize it. In May 1942, the original 29 Navajo recruits were isolated inside a secured barracks at Camp Pendleton. Their commanding officers locked the doors and issued an unprecedented order. They were to systematically invent a brand new military lexicon from scratch. Inside that barracks, the recruits did not just agree on casual slang. They methodically engineered a two-tier cryptographic dictionary, forcing an ancient, nature-based language to describe the mechanized slaughter of the modern battlefield. First, they mapped industrial warfare to the natural world. They assigned specific, unchangeable Navajo terms to over 200 standard military assets. A submarine, cutting silently through the ocean, became Beshlo, meaning iron fish. A nimble fighter plane darting through the sky was designated Dahe-Tihi, the hummingbird. A heavy bomber was a buzzard. A battleship became a whale, and a hand grenade was simply a potato. But the recruits knew they could not invent a dedicated word for every single geographic location, officer's surname, or obscure tactical designation they might encounter. To bridge this gap, they engineered a secondary phonetic alphabet. To spell out an unfamiliar target, an operator would translate the English letter to a corresponding English word and then speak the Navajo translation of that specific word. For the letter A, they used the English word ant, translating it to the Navajo Walachi. The letter B was bear, translated as shush. This brutal process fundamentally transformed a spoken cultural tradition into a rigorous, standardized military code. It required intense, flawless memorization. Every single recruit had to learn this dual-layered system with absolute precision, knowing that in the chaos of a combat zone, a single mistranslated syllable or forgotten code word would not just delay a message, it could call friendly artillery fire directly onto their own positions. After weeks of relentless drilling, the system was stress-tested and deemed theoretically secure on a chalkboard in Southern California. But theoretical security meant nothing to the Marines preparing to launch the first major Allied offensive of the war. The true test of this unwritten code awaited them thousands of miles away in the grueling, blood-soaked mud of the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, that chalkboard theory was thrown into the meat grinder of Guadalcanal. As the 1st Marine Division fought to hold the humid, malaria-ridden perimeter around Henderson Field, traditional communications doctrine completely collapsed. The heavy jungle canopy absorbed radio waves, wires were constantly severed by artillery fire, and enemy patrols infiltrated American lines with terrifying ease. In this chaotic environment, the first group of code talkers were assigned to frontline command posts. Almost immediately, the system demonstrated its profound operational value. During a critical Japanese counterattack along the Matanakaw River, a Marine battalion found itself heavily suppressed by enemy mortars. The commanding officer needed an immediate, precise naval gunfire support mission from the warships offshore. Using conventional cipher machines, encrypting the target coordinates, transmitting them, and decrypting them on the flagship would have taken over 30 minutes, an eternity that would have ensured the battalion's destruction. Instead, a code talker grabbed the microphone and transmitted the fire mission instantly, using the newly invented lexicon. Within seconds, a receiving Navajo operator aboard a heavy cruiser decoded the coordinates and fed them directly to the gun plotting room. High explosive shells began slamming into the Japanese mortar positions less than 3 minutes after the initial request. The unprecedented speed of this transmission shocked veteran signals officers. It was not just a communication tool, it was a force multiplier that allowed American commanders to call in fire support and coordinate complex infantry maneuvers faster than the enemy could physically react. As the bloody island-hopping campaign expanded across the Pacific, pushing into the brutal mangrove swamps of Cape Gloucester and the fortified coral ridges of Taraba and Saipan, the operational demands on the code grew exponentially. The original dictionary of 200 terms quickly proved insufficient for the rapidly evolving complexity of amphibious warfare. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Marine Corps systematically expanded the cryptographic vocabulary. By the time the fleet reached the Marianas, the vocabulary had grown to over 400 highly specific military terms. Every new weapon system, tactical maneuver, and operational command had to be mapped to the natural world and memorized with flawless precision. To prevent Japanese intelligence from identifying phonetic patterns through frequency analysis, the operators also introduced phonetic redundancy. For common English letters like A, E, I, O, and U, they assigned multiple alternative Navajo words. The letter A could be transmitted as Wolachi for ant, Belasana for apple, or Tsenil for axe. This meant that even if an operator spelled out the same geographic location twice in a single message, the actual audio transmission sounded entirely different each time. Executing this complex mental gymnastics while crouching in a waterlogged foxhole under heavy artillery bombardment and direct sniper fire required extraordinary psychological discipline. A single slip of the tongue could misdirect an entire bomber squadron or call artillery down on friendly troops. While the Marines were mastering this spoken cipher on the front lines, a very different kind of drama was unfolding inside the listening posts of the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. For years, the intelligence units of the Japanese Army and Navy had taken immense pride in their ability to intercept, crack, and exploit Allied radio communications. Their English-speaking operators were elite professionals who had successfully unraveled standard American field ciphers throughout the early months of the war. But as the Solomon Islands campaign progressed, these Japanese listening posts began intercepting thousands of strange, chaotic transmissions across tactical Marine Corps frequencies. The Japanese operators taped the broadcasts and played them back endlessly in their analysis centers, completely baffled by what they were hearing. The audio streams contained no recognizable linguistic syntax, no European word roots, and no predictable mathematical cadences. The tonal inflections rose and fell in patterns that completely defied their extensive linguistic training. Because the language was entirely unrecorded in any international academic archive, the Japanese cryptanalysts could not even identify the language family they were listening to. Initial intelligence assessments concluded that the Americans had successfully deployed a revolutionary, highly sophisticated mechanical cipher machine capable of scrambling voice communications in real time. The Japanese military establishment poured immense technical resources into attempting to reverse engineer this non-existent cryptographic machine, throwing their signals intelligence division into a state of frustrated, paralyzing confusion. As American forces pushed closer to the Japanese mainland, this frustration turned into desperate panic. During the invasion of the Philippines, the Japanese military finally captured a Navajo American soldier who had been serving in a standard U.S. Army infantry unit, entirely disconnected from the Marine Corps Code Talker program. Realizing his ethnic background, Japanese intelligence officers immediately transferred the prisoner to a specialized interrogation center in Tokyo. They were convinced they had finally found the key to unlocking the mysterious Allied radio traffic. The interrogators placed headphones over the captured soldier's ears and played hours of intercepted Marine Corps battle transmissions, demanding that he translate the messages under threat of torture. The captive listened intently to the tapes. He could clearly recognize the words of his native tongue. He heard his people's words for ironfish, hummingbirds, potatoes, and various animals of the desert. But because he lacked the specific, highly classified cryptographic training that mapped these words to modern military terminology, the messages sounded like absolute, incoherent nonsense to him. He truthfully told his interrogators that while the operators were speaking Navajo, the sentences had no logical meaning. The interrogation continued for weeks, but the prisoner could provide no actionable tactical intelligence. This failure was a crushing blow to Japanese intelligence. The realization that even a native speaker of the language could not decipher the military transmissions inadvertently proved to the Japanese high command that the American system was not only technically brilliant, but entirely impenetrable. The code had succeeded beyond the wildest expectations of the Marine Corps, completely neutralizing Japan's signals intelligence capabilities and securing an absolute tactical advantage across the Pacific. Yet this extraordinary operational success generated a severe, entirely unintended vulnerability on the actual battlefield, one that placed the operators themselves in lethal, constant danger from the very men they were sworn to protect. In the claustrophobic, paranoia-inducing jungles of the Pacific Theater, physical appearance became a sudden and deadly liability. As the island-hopping campaign intensified, Navajo Marines navigating the chaotic front lines were repeatedly mistaken for Japanese infantrymen by their own exhausted, trigger-happy comrades. Moving between scattered command posts or stringing communication wire through the dense canopy, code talkers were frequently detained at bayonet point, violently interrogated, and nearly executed by American sentries who were absolutely convinced they had captured an enemy infiltrator disguised in a stolen Marine Corps uniform. The sheer frequency of these terrifying friendly fire incidents forced Marine commanders to implement a drastic security measure. They began assigning dedicated, heavily armed personal bodyguards to shadow the code talkers at all times. Ostensibly, these riflemen were tasked with protecting these highly valuable communications specialists from both enemy snipers and jumpy American patrols. But these bodyguards carried a secondary, strictly classified directive that laid bare the ruthless calculus of wartime intelligence. The spoken Navajo cipher had become the single most critical operational asset in the Pacific Fleet. Under no circumstances could the system or the human mind that held it fall into enemy hands. If a code talker was pinned down and captured by Japanese forces was imminent, the bodyguard was under standing orders to shoot his own operator. The men transmitting the tactical orders that saved thousands of American lives were operating under the constant threat of execution from their own command. Furthermore, the absolute supremacy of the cipher demanded total institutional silence. To ensure Japanese intelligence remained completely blind to the program's nature, the Marine Corps initiated a systematic erasure of the Navajo operators from the official wartime record. Their vital tactical achievements were deliberately scrubbed from standard battle dispatches. Combat photographers were directed away from the communication tents, and their specific linguistic roles were intentionally buried under generic radio operator classifications. They were the central nervous system of the American Pacific Offensive, yet officially their unique contribution did not exist. Hunted by the enemy, endangered by their own allies, shadowed by guards ordered to kill them, and systematically erased from the very history they were writing, the Navajo Communication Network operated in an atmosphere of suffocating isolation. But this invisible, indispensable system was about to face its ultimate, most violent stress test on the black volcanic ash of a small island in early 1945. The ultimate test of this linguistic machine arrived on the morning of February 19, 1945, during the catastrophic violence of the Battle of Iwo Jima. The American strategy relied on overwhelming amphibious assault, but the Japanese defenders, entrenched deep within heavily fortified volcanic tunnels, unleashed a meticulously coordinated defense. As the first waves of Marines hit the black sand beaches, they were instantly pinned down by continuous, devastating artillery and mortar fire raining down from Mount Suribachi. Within the first few hours of the landing, the physical infrastructure of the American invasion began to disintegrate. Miles of field telephone wire were shredded by shrapnel. Conventional radio networks were jammed by enemy signals or rendered useless because encrypting and decrypting messages through mechanical ciphers took too long under the relentless barrage. Entire battalions were cut off, unable to request supporting fire or coordinate their advance. The operational cohesion of the invasion force was on the verge of total collapse. Into this communications void stepped just 6 Navajo Code Talkers, assigned to the command ship of the 5th Marine Division, operating continuously around the clock. During the first critical 48 hours of the battle, these 6 men became the sole reliable link between the desperate infantry on the beaches and the heavy naval guns offshore. Crouched below decks and in forward command posts, deafened by the roar of naval artillery, they transmitted and received a relentless stream of heavily encrypted tactical data. They did not just relay simple status updates. They rapidly translated complex alphanumeric grid coordinates, called in precise naval bombardment on hidden Japanese pillboxes, directed the agonizingly slow movement of Sherman tanks through the ash, and coordinated the urgent evacuation of thousands of wounded Marines. Over the course of those first 2 days, these 6 operators successfully processed more than 800 distinct tactical messages. They pushed the improvised dictionary of the Navajo Code to its absolute operational limit. Following the battle, Signal Officer Major Howard Connor of the 5th Marine Division conducted a rigorous review of the communications logs from those crucial first days. His conclusion, filed in official after-action reports, was unequivocal. He explicitly recorded that every single one of those 800 messages was transmitted and decoded without a single documented error. The system operated with a flawless mechanical precision that far outpaced the most sophisticated encryption machines in the American arsenal. Major Connor stated definitively that without the unprecedented speed and absolute accuracy of the Navajo communication network, the United States Marines would not have successfully taken Iwo Jima. The 22nd transmission, demonstrated years earlier in a quiet room back at Camp Elliott, had ultimately dictated the tempo of the American advance, overriding the chaos of the deadliest battle in Marine Corps history. The flawless execution at Iwo Jima proved that the Navajo communication network succeeded not through some romanticized warrior instinct, but through the ruthless, disciplined application of a complex linguistic structure adapted to the harsh realities of mechanized warfare. It remains the only unbroken spoken code in modern military history. While the German Enigma machine was shattered and sophisticated electromechanical ciphers were repeatedly compromised, this human-engineered system of syllables and phonetic substitutions withstood the full weight of enemy intelligence. It stands as a stark historical testament to how an overlooked, marginalized cultural resource became a decisive technological advantage. A language that had been actively suppressed by the United States government in assimilation boarding schools just decades prior became the exact tactical weapon that outpaced the military's most advanced cryptographic machinery. But the absolute supremacy of this cipher sealed its post-war fate. Because the code was so devastatingly effective, its mechanics were deemed too valuable to ever reveal. When the Code Talkers were discharged in 1945, they were bound by strict military orders to maintain total silence. Their families, their communities, and the American public were told absolutely nothing about the 2-tier dictionary or the localized phonetic alphabet. These operators returned home to a country completely unaware of their massive strategic impact, blending back into civilian life as standard infantrymen with intentionally sanitized service records. The entire program was locked away in classified military vaults and remained a tightly guarded state secret until 1968. For 23 years, the men who formed the impenetrable central nervous system of the Pacific Offensive lived in the shadows of an official history that completely erased their contribution. This clash between their monumental battlefield achievement and their decades-long enforced silence leads directly to the profound paradox at the very heart of this victory. In the ultimate historical paradox of the Second World War, the United States military secured its sweeping tactical victory across the Pacific theater by relying entirely on a cultural resource the federal government had spent decades attempting to systematically eradicate. The very same indigenous language that American assimilation boarding schools had once brutally punished Navajo children for speaking was deliberately engineered into the most devastatingly effective cryptographic weapon in the Allied arsenal. The Japanese military establishment was ultimately outmaneuvered and defeated, not just by overwhelming industrial steel or advanced machinery, but by the impenetrable unwritten syntax of an ancient tongue that the nation had nearly managed to destroy.